Okay, this is the video on chapter 30, basic macroeconomic relationships, and it is very short, at least what we're covering is. So you're really only responsible for what is in the PowerPoint. And we're going to economists of the last century, the 20th century. I don't know who will emerge this century, but he was very influential. He was writing during the Great Depression. He was a British economist, and he came up with all of these ideas that are in chapter 30. Keynes basically said, this was Great Depression, all you have left to do is increase government spending. That meant deficit spending, but there was nothing else at the time because we were in such a dire depression. Now, of course, some of the reasons for that were because the government basically cut off trade. That was a disaster. And also, the administration increased taxes, and we were already slowing down. Increased taxes, people have less money to spend. That's going to be a disaster. And it was. Keynes wasn't opposed to tax cuts, but he said they'd take too long to factor in. So he said, go out and spend money. And that's kind of what we're doing right now here in March of 2020 with the president talking about sending everybody $1,000. I don't know, something like that. Anyway, but let's look at what Keynes came up with in the marginal propensities. And Keynes said basically, if you can figure out how much someone will spend and how much they will save, you can come up with something called a multiplier, and you'll know how much spending to increase. It's kind of a simple concept, but does it work? Well, there are those that say it did and those that say it did not. We did eventually get out of the Great Depression, but World War II basically is when we got out of it. So, whether or not these policies work, but we'll look at what happened. So let's start with the marginal propensity to consume, which is just the likelihood that someone will spend an extra dollar of income. Marginal propensity to save, the likelihood that someone will save an extra dollar. And Keynes said, savings you can forget about because people are hoarding their money. After all, in the Great Depression, banks were failing. So where did people put their money? They stashed it in the mattress, behind the wall, buried it in a can in a backyard. But if it's not going through banks, then the banks don't have any money to lend. So he said, forget about the savings. All you need to worry about is what someone would consume. So let's look then at the next slide here. The marginal propensity to consume plus the marginal propensity to save equals 1 down at the bottom. That's because they're each a percentage. If you are likely to spend 80% of your income and save 20%, then that equals 1. Or if you're likely to spend 99% of your income and save 1%, then that's still 1. So if they're each a percentage, additional spending, additional saving is what we are looking at here. So let's see if we can make this bigger. There we go. So other determinants of disposable income, and this is an important definition, disposable income is after-tax income. Everybody pretty much pays some taxes, and disposable is what's left over to spend or to save. So that's the most important definition there. I'm going to skip over a couple of things here. Now we're going to just skip this section and get to the multiplier, because if we know we think we know what the marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save is, then we can come up with something called the multiplier. And this definition is important down at the bottom. We can figure what GDP would change or how much it would increase by multiplying the multiplier by that initial change in spending. Now, the multiplier is found by taking 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save, or 1 over MPS. That gives us the multiplier. So, please pay attention to your notes on this after the chapter PowerPoint. I have instructor notes there, and it does give you several examples. So let's say if the marginal propensity to save is 20%, then 1 over 0.2 would be the multiplier. So let's look at a simple example here. Let's say that government spending increased by $5. Let's put a silly little example in there, only it's not really that silly. During the Great Depression, we had these two programs called the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the WPA, Works Progress Administration. They were two Depression-era programs set up by Franklin Roosevelt, and they were to provide, it was a jobs program, basically providing mainly young men jobs. You've probably been to a national park that has a plaque somewhere that says built by the WPA in 1933. Jung Stadium in Joplin was actually built by one of those government jobs programs. So we built a lot of stuff. Hoover Dam, I don't even know where it is, out west somewhere, but it was built by a government program in the Depression to provide jobs. So let's say that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, marginal propensity to save is 0.25. So let's say that one person gets $5 a day to build Hoover Dam. $5 a day probably wasn't a bad wage during the Great Depression. But of that $5, that person is going to spend 75% of it and maybe send it back to their family in Kansas or somewhere. So that means they're going to save 1.25. So we can just kind of forget about that 1.25. But they are, let's say the 375 is sent back to the family in Kansas, and that family decides to buy a horse with that 375. You could buy a horse for that cheap during the Great Depression. Everything was so cheap, we had deflation. So the next person that they spent their 375 to buy a horse, and then that would mean the next person that had that 375 would now spend $2.81 and save 94 cents. That's 75% and 25%. And then the next person gets $2.81. They decide to buy a lawnmower. So they spend $2.11 on the lawnmower, save 70 cents, and the next person gets $2.11, and so on. We just keep going through these rounds. But it is easier to just say that initial change in spending, $5, times the multiplier. The multiplier is 1 divided by 0.25, which is 4. Multiplier equals 4, so multiply the $5 times 4, and we get $20. So the goal with all this spending rounds is to increase GDP. So that initial government spending program where that person was paid $5, and of course this would be multiplied times thousands of workers and thousands of people that were receiving income. But if they were spending 75% on average, saving 25% on average, then we could expect the GDP to increase by a multiple of that. So that initial $5 turned into $20 increase in GDP. Of course, we had to borrow money to pay for those programs, so the U.S. debt deficit did go up. But that's basically the multiplier. So this is important. The larger marginal propensity to consume results in a larger increase in spending. So the multiplier and the marginal propensity to consume are directly related. Larger marginal propensity to consume, larger the multiplier. Trying to get my lights back on here. So the multiplier and the marginal propensity to save are inversely related. A large marginal propensity to save would result in a smaller increase in spending. So what is the multiplier? It is 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So, or we could just say more easily, the multiplier is 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save. Now, again, you've got some examples of that in your course documents, these instructor notes that I provided for this chapter. So these are just some examples. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, then what is the marginal propensity to save? 0.1, because that equals 1. So 1 over 0.1 is 10. 10 becomes the multiplier. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, then the MPS is 0.2. 1 over 0.2 is 5. 5 becomes the multiplier. Our example that we just went through, the marginal propensity to consume 0.75. That means the marginal propensity to save is 0.25. 1 over 0.25 equals a multiplier of 4. So make sure that you read your notes and study the last word in chapter 31 that looks at the difference between the Keynesian view, which was very new at the time, again, Great Depression, and the classical view was pretty much a laissez-faire, leave the economy alone, and don't get the government involved. Keynes was pretty adamant to get the government involved in the economy in the 30s. So we don't know what the actual multiplier is, and it could be down to 0. We don't really know what it is, but it was in theory, and Keynes came up with it, and it is behind many of the government stimulus programs that we have today, including this most recent one being talked about now to help the economy during the coronavirus epidemic, or pandemic, I guess. So that is all you need to know out of this chapter: multiplier, marginal propensity to consume, marginal propensity to save.